Even if you're using automated grading now, are you still stuck using first-generation technology? Do you dream of using more modern approaches to provide feedback to students? But did you know that more than a third of feedback leads to negative performance impacts? Are you concerned that automated feedback might be demotivating? What can we do? What if, instead of marking all the errors in a student's work, we gave constructive feedback on practicing productive behaviors? If you haven't heard of it, behavioral design is all about designing systems to change behavior. So let's talk about how and why we can do that in CS education. Hi, my name is Stephen Edwards, and I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science at Virginia Tech. I'm going to be talking with you about automated feedback, the next generation, designing learning experiences. Now, the focus of this talk is on automated feedback as a concrete example, but I really am hoping that the comments that I provide are applicable both to people who build tools across all areas in computer science education and people who use those tools, and even the researchers who evaluate them. Now, in putting this talk together, one of the reasons that I picked the title Automated Feedback, the Next Generation was because I wanted to talk about the generations that we've been through and how we've gotten to where we are now. I realize that only appeals to a portion of our audience, however, and the alternate title, Automated Feedback, A New Hope, is equally applicable, and we'll see how that comes in as we get further into the talk. So, how did we get where we are now? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there have been three major generations of automated grading tools and ask about where we can go next. The first generation of automated grading in computer science really began back in the 1960s. And you could find several papers from that era that describe the techniques that were being used. Probably the most famous is Jack Hollingsworth's paper from 1960. And one of the interesting quotes there is this, where he says, talking about his automated grading approach, that the grader easily justifies itself on economic grounds. It accomplishes more than savings in time and money. It makes possible the teaching of programming to large numbers of students. Now, these first generation techniques continue on even now, but eventually, starting in the 1980s and moving into full speed in the 1990s, we entered a new generation of automated grading where people were focused on analysis beyond just looking at the behavior of the software and did it produce the correct output. Assist was one of the most well-known systems in the 1990s to go beyond looking at program correctness and instead try to assess the quality of the software that students turned in. By the time we get to the mid-2000s in this generation, we see other papers, including this one that I presented at SIGCSE in 2004, talking about the impact of focusing only on output correctness. I wrote, students receive feedback only on the end result they produce and tend to equate a program that produces the right output with an effective solution. The learning process matters little in grade outcomes, and students only receive indirect feedback on what and how they learn. So the focus on analysis beyond program output was more prominent during this time. Later, I also wrote that focusing on output correctness first and foremost in assessment actually affects students and shifts the way that they pay attention and the details that they consider important in the assignments that they're turning in. And that is sort of the foreshadowing of the fact that how we provide feedback affects student behavior, and that's something that's really important to consider. By the mid-2000s, we were moving into a third generation where automated grading systems were really looking at large volume data collection and learning analytics. In this paper from the mid-2000s, I wrote about adding these capabilities to WebCat and providing a mechanism for providing access to the large amount of data that is collected on a regular basis by assessment tools and systems. Later in the same decade, Raymond Lister wrote an interesting retrospective where he looked forward to a future where we routinely collect this kind of data in our educational tools for learning analytics purposes. So that brings us to the question of what will the fourth generation be? Where do we need to go as a community, and how will we get there? Or perhaps more importantly, are we doing it wrong right now? To answer that question, let's think about what we're really trying to do with the feedback that we give to students. So what's our goal? Well, our aim is really to promote student learning, but that comes in a variety of different forms. For example, we're very interested in making sure that they acquire the knowledge that we're trying to teach in our courses. In programming courses in particular, that might be understanding the mechanics of programming language features, how to use algorithmic strategies to solve programming problems, how to code in a way that is easy for other people to understand, follow idiomatic practices, and use common programming patterns. But in addition to those kinds of knowledge level behaviors, we're also interested in application skills, synthesis, analysis, and evaluation skills that students might use to read and interpret code, apply language features in new situations, model and represent information, and write programs to solve recurring problems. However, beyond the knowledge and skill level, there are also a number of behaviors that we are interested in teaching to our students as they learn. Those might include how to manage their time, particularly on assignments as they become more and more complex, how to work incrementally and self-check their work as they go so that they can find problems early and when they're easier to fix, setting goals for themselves, monitoring their progress towards those goals, being persistent in the face of adversity and challenges when they're working on our assignments. All of these behaviors are things that we're trying to teach as well. And finally, we're also talking about beliefs, things like their own understanding of self-efficacy, whether they believe in a growth mindset and their ability to improve their performance through practice, whether they are taking ownership over and responsibility for their own learning, are they goal-oriented in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And all of these things are important in our courses, and it raises the question of how is our feedback being shaped by trying to teach these skills, behaviors, and beliefs. And that brings us back to this question of, are we doing it wrong?
There, that should do it. Let's see if my tests work. Awesome! It finally works. All I have left to do is turn it in and see what the autograder says. What? A 0? Ugh, this is so frustrating. My program's working.
So we have to ask ourselves, in this situation, is this student focused on what we want them to learn? In actuality, there definitely is a potential dark side to automated feedback. So let's talk a little bit about what can go wrong. For example, Kluger and Denisi found that 2 out of 5 feedback comments had a negative effect on student performance. Their meta-analysis is very interesting, and their further work is really relevant for those who want to look it up. But did you realize that that much feedback might have negative impacts? It's common to think that giving feedback to students is great, and the more feedback that we give, the more detail we provide, that's an improvement over giving less. However, it doesn't always turn out to have a positive impact, and that's something we have to be aware of. In fact, there are complex connections between the way in which feedback is received by a student and the way that perception motivates their selection of a course of action and the learning activity that may or may not follow from that. When we think about a student submitting work on an assignment, our engineering mindset leads us to think about objectively assessing the work product that is submitted. We also tend to focus on the tool as the system. But when the feedback is seen by the student, we need to realize that the system is larger than just the software. There is a human in the loop, and our intent is actually to cause an effect on the student. How feedback is framed can significantly affect the student's perceptions and emotional reactions. Students can feel a sense of accomplishment, or confusion, or frustration, or even anger. We need to intentionally design our feedback to achieve the impact we want, and we cannot do that if we ignore the human in the loop. In fact, the way that feedback is presented can have an impact on how it is received, and that means that sometimes even the most well-meaning feedback can come across the wrong way and reduce a learner's motivation. There are resources all around the web for K through 12 teachers on how to phrase feedback positively for students. Those aren't as often applied at the post-secondary level, but there's a reason why those resources exist, and there's a reason why people pay so much attention to the framing or the tone in which feedback is given. So we also need to take into account what happens with the scores that we give to assignments. Did you know that studies have shown that feedback should not be given at the same time as overall grades? As the quote here says, one of the issues is that students may view the main function of the feedback comments as justifying the grade, and that they might also ignore specific diagnostic comments you give when a grade is also included. But how many automated grading tools do you know give feedback without a score? You know, when you think about the way people might give feedback in an English class where students are writing essays and getting comments on their draft about how to improve it before they finally turn it in, it's a very different kind of model that teachers use compared to what we're used to in computer science. And we should really think about that analogy and what we can learn from it. It also turns out that too much feedback provided all at once can be overwhelming for students and can make it hard for them to figure out what the best course of action is. Only pointing out errors can be demotivating. Pointing out large numbers of small errors can come across as being very trivial and micromanaging or controlling, as if there's only one right way to compose a solution and trying to straitjacket students into a specific form for their answer. Negative phrasing, only pointing out errors, can be demotivating as well. And it's better instead to focus on the students' progress towards their learning goals rather than just the errors. So where do I think we can go for the next generation of automatic feedback? I think we should take a look at behavioral design. Behavioral design, in essence, is about designing artifacts, in this case software, to shape or influence human behavior. What does that mean? Well, the Behavioral Design 2020 report takes a look back at the last decade of work in behavioral design and also looks at future efforts coming up. And one of the things that they try to highlight is both that this is a breakout idea in design that is affecting people across many disciplines, not just in computer science, and that there are a lot of ways that it could have impact in many new contexts that people have not previously envisioned. And as I mentioned, behavioral design is all about designing for behavior change, but there are a lot of related terms that you will see and that you will hear people use when they are talking about behavior change. And they include things like behavior modification, which has its roots in operant conditioning, persuasive design, behavior shaping, developing habits, nudging, behavioral economics. All of these terms have slightly different meanings and apply in slightly different communities, but they really all fall under this umbrella idea of intentionally trying to change the behavior of people through design affordances. So nudging in particular, what's that? Well, nudging is an intervention that predictably affects the choices that a person makes without necessarily forcing their course of action and without necessarily appealing to economic incentives of a particular form. So there are a lot of modern papers about nudging that talk about the various ways that nudging might be applied in software design and systems. What are nudges? One of the most famous examples, this one here, goes back to the 1990s in Amsterdam, when in the airport they started adding pictures of flies in urinals And it turned out that did affect the behavior of people, producing, let's say, better aim and less spillage. Another example, this comes from North Lakeshore Drive in Chicago and was recently written up in Road and Track. And on that road near a curve in the road, they painted lines on the pavement, but the lines get closer together as you approach the corner. And for drivers, that gives them a perception that they are speeding up and actually encourages them to put on the brakes as they approach the corner. This next example comes from a couple of families in Michigan who decided to put up signs encouraging people to do silly walks while going across the sidewalks outside their homes. And this was an internet craze on Instagram. There are a lot of funny clips. They started a trend where people in a variety of places put up their own versions of the signs, harking back to Monty Python's Ministry of Silly Walks. And this is a perfect example of nudging, where they put up an environmental intervention, in this case the signs, with the aim of changing behavior. There's no economic incentive, and people are doing it, in this case, in part for the fun of it, right? And clearly this intervention has a really positive impact on the people going by. It's a great example of a nudge. Similar, this is a stairway next to an escalator in Stockholm, painted like a piano to encourage people to take the stairs instead of the escalator. And that's been replicated in a couple of other environments. There are also examples of traffic patterns of, here is a picture of painted on crosswalk markings that, because of the 3D effect, because of the way they're painted, encourage people to slow down. And this started, again, probably 15 years ago in Pennsylvania and has been used in various places around the world. This picture is from Iceland. So nudges can really influence behavior. They're one tool in the toolkit in the area of behavior change or behavioral design. What are some others? Well, one area where you can see different rudimentary aspects of behavioral design discussed quite often is video games. And gamification, or applying game elements in a non-game context, is a very well-known idea in education, but it's primarily discussed in terms of trying to increase motivation or engagement, that sort of thing. If you actually look at the way games operate, though, a lot of them use mechanics that are actually designed to change your behavior. Now, granted, a lot of the reasons for changing behavior are actually to make money for game producers. And there are a lot of videos on YouTube that you can watch that discuss these ideas. As an example, a variety of games that use these kinds of mechanisms going back more than 5 years include things like Candy Crush, Brave Frontier, Puzzle and Dragons, Dragon's World. And these games use different kinds of mechanisms to influence behavior in different ways. And usually they involve many mechanisms. Just one example, Brave Frontier has an arena feature that actually uses a kind of in-game currency, in this case, energy orbs, that limit how you can play in the arena, how many times you can challenge and how quickly you can challenge other people. Similarly, Dragon's World uses something similar in their arena, where they use a game energy system to manage your time in the same way. Both of these mechanisms are aimed at regulating how much you can consume. In this particular case, most likely to prevent you from overloading or becoming desensitized to the game. They can limit how much you interact. They can also use it to drive up revenue for in-app purchases. They also limit the length of any one game session by forcing you to wait. And in effect, they exert an influence to change the way you manage your time when you're playing the game. And that's to the game author's benefit, but the same kinds of principles can be used to change the way students manage their time, or to change other kinds of behaviors if you're careful about the mechanisms that you employ. But once again, with behavioral design, we also have to worry about a dark side. Behavior change is intentionally manipulative, and it can definitely be used for evil. Like I said, with game designers, they're using it for their own profit. In that Behavioral Design 2020 report, one of the contributors says that the ethics of certain behavior change techniques, nudging, and dark patterns in design are a matter of heated debate, and that the ethics of the right and wrong ways of influencing people's behavior, how we might define positive behaviors or for good, and the potential regulation or guidelines needed regarding the use of certain behavioral change techniques are really big questions. Another contributor to that report also says that behavioral design is being used to trick people into buying products, into giving up personal data, and it's being used to push gig economy workers into punishing and unsafe schedules without breaks. There are a lot of papers that have been written about behavioral design and the ethics of manipulating users, and those are definitely worth consideration when you're talking about these techniques. In particular, a lot has been written about Uber and the way Uber uses what are now considered behavioral design techniques to manipulate their drivers and whether or not that is ethical. And one of the main concerns there is that Uber has adopted a number of practices that are primarily for the benefit of the company at the expense of their employees. And most people would consider that to be a serious breach of their power position in terms of their relationship with their drivers. Instead, what we really need to think about is what's becoming known as socially responsible behavioral design. And that means asking questions like, when you are using behavior change mechanics, whose values are being promoted and who benefits from the behavior change? In our position as educators, we're already manipulating the classroom, and it's our responsibility to do that in a way that bears out our educational mission. We believe we're doing things for the benefit of our students. And as long as we keep that in mind in terms of behavior change and engineering that into our feedback, then we're on the right path. We also need to make sure that we inform students of the mechanics that we're using and the goals that we're trying to achieve with those mechanics so that they understand what's happening. Not only is that important from an ethical standpoint, but it also helps promote their buy-in if they believe in the goals that we are trying to promote. So, what would our feedback look like if we decided to embrace this approach? Can we combine better feedback strategies with behavioral design? What if we used feedback for more than just correcting errors? What if we communicated to students what good practices are and encouraged our students to set personal goals of demonstrating this model of behavior? What if we recognized and rewarded progress towards and achievement of these personal goals? And what if we systematically reinforced all these ideas in the feedback that we gave students and throughout our educational tools? At Coley Calling last year, we proposed an approach to systematically use gamification to do exactly this. We suggested perhaps using role-playing game mechanics to focus students on 5 specific self-regulatory skills that we wanted to promote. The example student profile shows how one might represent a student's progress on mastering the 5 skills: time management, incremental development, self-checking, persistence, and planning. We may not all agree on the ideal set of skills we want to reinforce, but we saw these as a useful start. As students work on assignments, they receive feedback on how they are demonstrating these skills. They gradually increase in player level as a clear representation of their progress, and leveling is related to earning experience points by demonstrating skills. That is, by practicing the behaviors that we want to encourage. All of the feedback that they receive is constantly tied back to this central model. You can combine this with other gamification mechanics to reinforce the target behaviors. The goal is to communicate to students that mastery of these skills is valued by the course's community, to encourage students to aspire to master these skills, and to recognize and reward students as they progress. There are definitely measurement challenges here, but work we've done over the past 5 years suggests that there are practical ways to measure student effort and give feedback on behavior and process instead of just looking at the program. This hinges on systematic data collection and is a natural outgrowth of third-generation automated assessment tools. Some of that measurement work is already being incorporated into interventions that can be a part of this systematic approach to behavioral change. For example, giving students daily missions is proving to be a successful nudge technique. It helps identify small, achievable goals, promotes regular engagement, increases the rate of completing these small goals, and it also gives students an increased sense of accomplishment and progress as they complete these small goals while they're working on an assignment. It helps with time management, with planning, with incremental development, and with self-checking. We also have done work with submission energy and using it to change the way that students manage their time, to encourage them to start work earlier, to work in more work sessions instead of binge programming at the last minute before the deadline, and to think more deliberately about how they spend their time. This use of submission energy to change behavior was inspired by the mobile games discussed earlier. What about the feedback a student might receive on an automatically graded assignment? Instead of focusing on listing all the errors that need to be fixed, what if we pointed out a couple of the most positive aspects to reinforce them? And then summarize the most important goal the student should focus on to improve next. We could also give the student a smaller number of secondary areas, but we need to be careful to phrase the feedback in an encouraging way that helps the student take ownership over their own improvement. We can also provide easy access to explanations about why specific practices and goals are important and how they connect to the intended learning outcomes for the course to keep the feedback framed on learning. While we could also provide specific detailed examples of issues that should be addressed, we need to be mindful of the amount and how it is phrased, with an awareness of the various ways that feedback can produce negative performance impact. So when our automated tools give feedback, instead of just marking all the mistakes, what they should do is identify a small number of key areas for improvement. Focus on the task the student is performing or the process they're using, not just the product that they are producing. Recognize the specific behaviors and achievements that they are actually demonstrating, and suggest ways to improve, that is, help students identify their own self-improvement goals. And most importantly, save the score for the finalized version of the work and minimize the emphasis on scoring during draft revisions while a student is still developing their final solution. So these mechanisms aren't particularly new, and they have been discussed elsewhere. But here, what I'm really focusing on is, by a clever combination of these, you can focus on a systemic approach to continually reinforcing core behaviors that you want to encourage. In this particular case, self-regulation behaviors. And that you can consistently nudge students to practice these behaviors, and that overall that allows you to create a combination that's mutually synergistic and that focuses on the larger goals of student behavior change. Hopefully, these kinds of strategies can help move students to focusing on the things we want them to learn.
Okay. There, that should do it. Now let's see what the auto grader says. Well, it looks like I'm making progress. I guess now I just have to add some more tests and remove things so I can figure out why that part's not working. At least practicing will help me complete future assignments faster.
Okay, so where does that bring us to? Let's take a look at what we've covered. So first, it's pretty clear that in terms of most of the automated grading tools that we have, that we're still struggling with first-generation approaches. Our feedback often risks negative performance impact, and that's because we mostly focus on pointing out errors, not really tying feedback directly to student learning goals, and not paying as much attention to how we frame that as we could. Behavioral design, on the other hand, really would encourage us to think about how our system designs actually affect the people who interact with them, and trying to take a systematic focus on what behavior change we're actually trying to achieve with our students. We want to target not just their learning about basic programming concepts, but the skills that they are developing, the behaviors that they're practicing, and even the beliefs that they hold, particularly their beliefs about their own learning and what helps them be successful. My goal is to provide a vision for a new hope in automated feedback that can pull us out of this first generation rut that we are in that still dominates current tool development. And of course, we still have to avoid the dark side by embracing socially responsible behavioral design. That being said, though, why don't we currently have automated grading tools like this? Well, I'm working on them, and I'm hoping that through this talk I can inspire others to look in new directions and ways that we can improve our automated feedback tools, our automated grading processes. So thank you very much for spending your time with me. I hope you found this talk informative and beneficial, and I really appreciate your time.